Most people who talk to you about the early history of science fiction begin with Lucian of Samosata, a Hellenistic writer who lived in the 2nd century AD. Lucian's true history is a story in which the narrator is caught up in a waterspout and carried to the moon. And I think that's science fiction to just about the extent that the whirlwind that carried Elijah to heaven is. If you're interested in that kind of thing, the literature is full of imaginary voyages to the moon in which the means of getting there is whimsical or supernatural. In one of Cyrano de Bergerac's voyages, for example, he surrounded himself with little bottles of dew, and when the sun made the dew rise in the morning, he'd carried him up with it. Some writers harnessed flocks of birds. But the most popular and reliable method of getting to the moon was just to have an angel come down and get you. For there to be science fiction, there first had to be science, and that means we begin with a period of roughly 150 years from 1530, when the first treatise Copernicus wrote was circulated in manuscript, to 1687, when Newton's Principia was published. During this short period, man's way of looking at the universe was turned on its head. Now, science fiction is based on an assumption of a dynamic universe governed by natural law. A dynamic universe as opposed to the static or cyclical universe of classical times, and governed by natural law rather than by the whims of the gods. In these two ways, science fiction reflects a worldview that didn't begin to come into existence until the 16th century and was not widespread until the 18th. All through this period, there were many imaginary voyages to the moon and the sun. They were very popular, and people got very excited about the idea of plurality of worlds. But these imaginary voyages were satires. The moon or the sun was just a convenient place to put in an invented society that could be used to mirror the eccentricities of our own. When the satire is good, as it is in Swift's Voyage to Laputa, or Voltaire's Microméga, in which an inhabitant of Saturn visits us, then these voyages are lively. When it's poor, and it is usually poor, you might as well forget it. In 1848, here in this cottage, in what is now part of Greater New York, a sick, discouraged young writer named Edgar Allan Poe wrote Melanta Tauta, a story about a balloon trip in the year 2848, 1,000 years in the future. This story is satire of a not particularly subtle kind. It's in the form of a letter dated April 1st, but it is satire laid in a changed future rather than in a remote country, the first such story that I know of. Among Poe's predictions in this story are magnetic engines and the transatlantic cable, which he imagines being laid on floating platforms. In this little story, I think we see the first unequivocal appearance of the idea that the future will be essentially different from the past, the idea of irreversible social changes brought about by changes in technology. In this sense, even though every one of Poe's predictions was wrong, Melanta Tauta is modern science fiction, and Jules Verne's stories, which are full of amazingly accurate forecasts, are not. Verne laid his stories in the present, and he used only inventions which were actually available at the time he wrote. Submarines and airships and other devices that he wrote about all existed. He only imagined bigger submarines and bigger airships, in spite of which 5 or 6 of his 64 novels have been continuously in print for more than 70 years and have fascinated generations of English and American readers. And still, this was not quite what we mean by science fiction, because it was too cautious in forecasting technological change, and because it did not take into account any social change at all. For that, after Poe, we have to wait a few years for the first scientific romances of H.G. Wells.